Hey guys, thanks for tuning in to another video on ForgottenWeapons.com. I'm Ian McCollum and I'm here today at the Rock Island Auction Company taking a look at a registered transferable AR-18 machine gun. That's what the 18 is, that indicates the full auto version. And this AR-180, the extra zero on the end indicating semi-automatic only, this AR-180 rifle, as well as a couple other AR-180 rifles that we'll take a look at later in the video. We're going to go through really the whole family of original AR-18 and 180 rifles and accessories. So it's going to be really cool. We will start with, of course, the basic history of the design. The rifle here is generally thought of as like the budget version of the AR-15. This is made out of sheet metal, bent and stamped sheet metal components instead of forged and milled aluminum. So that view isn't entirely wrong. This sort of is the budget version, and that's kind of how it was designed. However, the design actually originates with the AR-10, not the AR-15. So AR in all of these designs stands for Armalite, which was the company that owned the rights to them. Eugene Stoner first designs the AR-10 for Armalite. They, by the way, had rifles from AR-1 through 9, or firearms, and I've got videos on a couple of those. The 10 was the semi-automatic 7.62 NATO caliber military rifle that they hoped to sell to a bunch of major military powers. As that trial is progressing and not really going all that well, one of the things that Armalite does is they scale the rifle down to 5.56 caliber, and that becomes the AR-15. The AR-15, of course, goes into U.S. military trials. Now, during this time, Armalite is experimenting with some ways that maybe they can make the AR-10 a little bit less expensive, and they're going to do this by replacing just the lower with sort of an aluminum or a steel sheet metal bent or stamped lower assembly. That rifle is the AR-12, and it never goes into production, but that's the designation that was set aside for it, and it's a developmental project. Now, as the AR-15 trials in the US military progress, Armalite ends up selling the rights to the gun to Colt, and Eugene Stoner leaves. That's his baby. Without it, what's he doing there? He goes to work for Cadillac Gauge, where he will end up designing the Stoner 63. But what happens is this leaves Armalite without their main design, which is the Stoner bolt gas impingement, that's not really gas impingement, system. They don't have their chief engineer, they don't have Stoner anymore. So what are they going to do? They want to come up with something that's still an interesting product for the market. And they go back to that AR-12. They can't use the AR-style gas system, the Stoner-style gas system, because they no longer own the rights to it. So they kind of redesign it, and they go to a short-stroke gas piston, very much like the German G43 or the Soviet SVT-40. And they put that on top of their sheet metal lower, and now they're going to go with a sheet metal upper as well. This rifle, still in 7.62 NATO, is the AR-16, which is, again, a subject for another entire video. However, so they've got the AR-16, and that's a cool potential product, but the AR-15 has proven, the 5.56 caliber is proven more popular than the 7.62 in a lot of places. And so in 1963, Armalite's new chief engineer, a guy named Arthur Miller, scales the AR-16 down to 5.56 caliber, and that is the AR-18. So with all that, we finally got into this rifle. What they ended up with was a rifle that was relatively easy and inexpensive to produce. It's not so much the cost of production necessarily as the cost of the machinery to set up the production. Armalite was hoping to sell these rifles to maybe second-tier military powers. They kind of recognized that maybe this wasn't really the thing for Great Britain, United States, Germany, France. Well, they're not going to be able to sell them to Russia or China at this point, but they realized that this isn't really a first-tier military power thing, but if they can get an inexpensive rifle and they can be able to sell this complete manufacturing package, like we'll help you set up a factory and you can build the rifles under license. That's sort of the system that Armalite was looking for. And this rifle sets that up pretty well. It's got this nice, well-proven gas system. The bolt mechanism is taken right off the AR-15 because they didn't have to worry about any patents on that. So it's that like 7-lug rotating bolt, very similar to the AR-15. It is a light rifle. It's under 7 pounds, 6.25 to 6.75 pounds, depending on who you talk to and whether or not it's got scopes, mags, ammo, sling, that sort of stuff. The standard rifles all have side-folding stocks, which is pretty cool. You've got an 18-inch barrel, so it kind of cuts a balance between a full-length rifle and a short carbine. And they're offering this in either full auto or semi-auto form. Initially, Armalite does do some production in California, in Costa Mesa, California, where they're based. But again, they're really not a production facility. They're not a big factory. So they'll make guns, but what they really want to do is license production to other people. And if they can sell them to the military, great. They'll set up licensing that way, but they also want to sell them commercially. And so they set up a deal in probably 1966, or maybe early 67, with the Howa Company, which is a rifle factory located in Nagoya, Japan. Howa's looking for commercial contracts. Armalite's looking for someone to make the rifle. Good deal they set up. Howa's going to start making rifles for Armalite. They'll be imported back into the US, sold on the market here, and the deal hits a big snag because just like before rifles have even started shipping, I suspect, or certainly very early in the deal, the Japanese government makes a decision that they're not willing to sell rifles to military forces that are at war. Well, the US is, and this kind of spoils a lot of Armalite's plans to potentially sell these to the military market. So the deal with Howa will last until 1974, and when Armalite is able to, they negotiate a new licensing contract, and this time it goes to the Sterling Company in the UK. And Sterling will manufacture the guns, and they'll manufacture a lot more of them than Howa did. These guns actually were sent out for trials, but we'll talk about the final ultimate production and results after we take a look at the mechanics of how this thing actually works. Overall, the AR-18 or AR-180 is really a very handy, lightweight, slim, it's a nice handling rifle. So if we start with looking at some of the markings here, well, this is a Costa Mesa production. So this is made in the US in California, and this is the very first manufacturer of the rifle. We have an Armalite logo here, AR-180, the caliber, patent pending. And we have the actual manufacturing mark over here, Armalite in Costa Mesa. The top of the grip is also molded with AR-18 Armalite. There is no AR-180 grip mold, they just did these all as AR-18. There is a selector switch here, which is of course two position and can't be rotated into safe if the hammer has dropped, just like the AR-15, so I'll show you that in a moment. Full auto would be in the back if this was a select fire rifle. On the other side, we have our bolt handle here, which is kind of dog-legged up to make it sort of ambidextrous, so you can reach it over the top of the rifle. We have a dust cover that will snap into position there, and this front angled surface impacts the charging handle when you cycle the gun, either fire it or manually cycle it, and that will pop the dust cover open. It does lock open on an empty magazine. We have our magazine catch here. Just push that in, the magazine comes out. The mag catch has basically a blade on it that locks into this slot in the magazine. The AR-180 and 18 magazines are identical to AR-15 magazines that have had this little slot added. So these original ones are marked AR-18, but you will also find converted magazines because converting them involves nothing more than cutting a little slot in the side. The safety is ambidextrous, which is kind of cool. Now that the hammer is cocked, I can put it into safe or semi there. All of these rifles come with folding stocks, which is pretty cool. We have two spring-loaded pins in the top of the hinge here that lock into the stock itself. So you push these in, and then you can fold the stock over. On this side of the rifle, we have a little plug there, and a plate on the side of the stock that has two wires in it. So our little pointy plug is going to snap into there, and that locks the stock in position. To unfold it, there is no particular unlocking latch. You just push, and the stock pops open. Armalite also arranged to produce a scope for these rifles. It is a 2.75 power by 20 millimeter scope. So you see they've got their name on it there. There are two different versions. We'll take a look at these in just a moment, but every rifle produced had a proprietary scope base on the top of the receiver. So to take the scope off, I'm going to take this little plunger, I'm going to lift it up, and then I actually push the scope back, and there we go, and lift it off. So it has this triangular sort of groove on the bottom of the scope, and this mounting bracket spot welded onto the top of the receiver. We have a two-position rear aperture sight. This is the 100-yard aperture, and we can flip it that way for the 200-yard. You have adjustable windage on the side here. That's going to just rotate this guy side to side. Elevation adjustment is done on the front sight by screwing that front sight post up or down. Disassembly is pretty slick. This is the rear extension of the recoil springs. So in order to disassemble the rifle, we're going to push this pin in, push this forward, and then the upper and lower will tip apart. The recoil springs pop out the back. So I can pull both of those out. We have 2 springs, each on its own guide rod. The upper and lower tip apart, much like an AR-15. I can pop this pin out, like so. That allows me to separate the upper from the lower. Looking at just the lower here, we have a fire control group made of pretty much all stamped components. This is actually our magazine hold open right there. It's going to get lifted up by the magazine follower and hook on the bolt. And of course, this is a hammer-fired rifle, so safe and semi only. There's the rest of your stamped sheet metal receiver. Moving to the upper assembly, we can pull the bolt back to here and then pull the charging handle out. It is keyed, so it only goes in one direction. We can then pull the bolt carrier out. There's your bolt. Looks very, very much like an AR-15 bolt. And you may also recognize this as looking a lot like a couple other bolts, like, for example, a British L85 bolt, a Singapore SAR-80 bolt, a G36 bolt, if you were able to get your hands on one, a Mexican FX05 bolt. The AR-18 was never a huge commercial success. However, mechanically speaking, it was the framework, it was the basic model for a surprising number of actually quite successful current issue military rifles. This short stroke gas piston, 7-lug rotating bolt style of design was really effective and really well liked, just not in the original AR-18 form. All right, next up we can remove the firing pin by popping out this pin. You're supposed to do this with a cartridge. I just have this universal disassembly tool here. Hold the firing pin in when you do this because it is under spring tension. So once this pin comes out, you then have your firing pin and its return spring that come out. Now this is very much like an AR-15. Once that's out, we can then pull the cam pin, which has a hole there. So normally when the firing pin is in place, the firing pin retains the cam pin and the cam pin retains the bolt. So here's our bolt, very AR-15-like, although you'll notice there are no gas rings back here because this doesn't have a gas system in it, like the AR-15. And then here is our bolt carrier. Moving further along, once we have removed the guide rods, these are what actually lock the upper handguard in place. So I can now just lift the upper handguard off. You can see the 2 holes here where the front of the guide rods lock it in place. With the upper handguard off, we have access to the whole gas system. So I can pull this back and then pull that off. Pull out the middle part of our gas piston here. We can then pull the rear of the gas piston off. There's the front of the gas piston off. And then we can pull out the rear section of the gas piston with its return spring. So there's that whole assembly. There is a gas port in the barrel here. Gas comes up, comes out this little tube where it then enters this blind piston. You'll notice that there are a couple holes here. So once this piston moves backwards a little bit, gas can vent out there to reduce the pressure. Back here, we have the working end of the gas piston, which goes through this center hole in the front trunnion, the other 2 holes being where the guide rods slot in place. This is going to go backwards and push the bolt back in the receiver when the rifle fires. And if we look at the face of the bolt, you can see that discolored spot where the gas piston, or rather the operating rod, pushes on it right there. There is a completely field stripped, or almost detail stripped except for the fire control group, AR-180. Now let's take a quick look at what's different in the AR-18. The markings are almost identical on the two guns. On the semi-auto, it's AR-180. On the select fire rifle, we have AR-18. You'll notice back here we have a 3-position safety selector that can go all the way over into auto, which this guy cannot. And then the serial numbers are slightly different. So all of the semi-auto rifles have an S prefix serial number, and Armalite in California made 4,018 of these. So this is towards the end of California production. The Select Fire AR-18s have an A prefix serial number. Now, despite the high number on this one, actually Armalite only made 1,171 full auto rifles. Looking a little closer at the internals, someone has drilled a hole in this, which is actually kind of cool because it allows me to lock the recoil assembly in there and open the gun up without the recoil springs coming out. Anyway, on the full auto gun, there are a couple changes to the fire control group. Mechanically, everything is the same. The gas piston's the same, the locking operation is the same. It's only the fire control group that changes between semi and full auto, and the one really visible change is the addition of this auto sear. So the upper receiver is different so that it can mount this piece. The purpose of this is when the gun cycles in full auto, the hammer gets held back by this until the bolt is all the way forward and locked. Then this gets tripped and it allows the hammer, it releases the hammer, which can then fall and fire the gun. You don't want the hammer, this is necessary because you don't want the hammer to just follow the bolt as the bolt goes forward, or else it will lose a bunch of its energy and you tend to have malfunctions and misfires. So there are changes to the hammer and some of the other parts in the fire control group as well as the addition of that guy. Moving on to our next manufacturer, which is Howa. We have a much bigger manufacturer's mark, a bigger Armalite logo there, which is kind of cool. AR-180, all the same basic information, but laid out differently. And you'll see this is manufactured for Armalite by Howa of Japan. Howa has a little bit of a different serial number sequence. Once again, they have S in front of their semi-auto serial numbers, but they actually started at 0001 and went to 1000 with serial numbers on the upper receiver. After that, they changed. They moved the serial number to the lower, which is where it really ought to be by US law. And then they jumped from 1,000 up to 10,000. So at the 1,001st gun that Howa produced was actually 10,001. And they went from there up to 12,915. So a grand total of just under 4,000 AR-180s manufactured by Howa. Those first 1,000, by the way, will also have a serial numbered flash hider. A little odd, but that's how they did it. And lastly, we have our Sterling guns made in England. So these go back to the original Armalite style of company logo and marking here, 5.56 millimeters still. And then we have manufactured for Armalite, again, of Costa Mesa by Sterling, England. The Sterling guns all have a vertical serial number on the lower, and they also kind of did their own different serial number thing. They noted where the last Howa number had been, and they decided to start theirs at 15,000. So Sterling would make a total of 12,362 rifles, meaning that their serial numbers run from 15,000 through 27,363. Sterling did also make full auto AR-18s. Those have an A prefix, just like the California guns, and they start at 10,000. I do also want to take a quick look at the scopes. This was a factory option. These were made in Japan. There are two different versions. They're fundamentally the same optics. They're 2.75 power, 20 millimeter lens. And see, even though the text is basically the same, there's a slight change in font. The way that you can tell the difference between the two is that one of them has a dot here, and you read the range markings at the back. The other one, you read the range markings from the side. They both start with a 1 to 200 yard marking, and then they'll move to 3, 4, and 500. Now the early pattern scopes have a crosshair with a heavy vertical bar at the top. The later pattern ones have the same range markings, but they are read from the back here. So 1 to 200, 3, 4, and 5. And these will have more of a simple double thickness or a variable thickness crosshair. Ultimately, Sterling would manufacture the AR-180 until 1984. When production shut down, they sold the last few guns in 1985, and that was the end of production of this style of the AR-180. I think the really interesting epilogue to this rifle is how it really kind of was a failure as a commercial rifle. You know, 21,000 isn't a complete flop, but it's certainly not the wild success that Armalite was hoping for. And certainly in military contracts, the AR-180 got almost nowhere. It was tested between 1964 and 1970 by the United States military, and it was found to be just kind of, in general, decent but not as good as the AR-15. They liked the heat, the way the AR-15 handled heat better. They liked the general handling better. I suspect the AR-15 was, it just has the feel of a sturdier rifle for whatever reason. And so no U.S. military contracts ever came to pass. It would only be in the years after that that the gun would see, like, all of its mechanism would show up in a lot of other military rifles, really starting with the SA-80. In fact, one of the very early models, like working test models of the SA-80 as a bullpup, as a concept, basically a proof of concept rifle, was in fact a Sterling produced AR-18 that was converted into a bullpup by Enfield to see if that would work. And then you'll see the mechanism come up over and over and over again. Basically every rotating bolt multi-lug gas piston gun that's in use today is ultimately a descendant of the AR-18. So look at the Steyr AUG, the SA-80, the G36, the Mexican FX-05, the Japanese Type 89. You know, the mechanism just proliferated into a huge number of places. You could almost get to the point of saying any military that isn't using the AR-15 is probably using an AR-18 variant, with just a few exceptions. So total production of the AR-180 was just over 20,000 rifles. This is the semi-auto version, sold almost entirely in the United States on the US commercial market. There were, I think, 1,127 full auto AR-18s manufactured by Armalite as well. Sterling also made some AR-18s, but those didn't come into the United States, or at least not in any significant numbers. Sterling would attempt to market these militarily and to national governments, and they had a little bit of success in Africa. They sold 400 of the guns to Botswana. They sold 350 to Swaziland. They sold 1,000 to Nigeria, and this is a mixture of AR-18s and AR-180s, and even AR-180 or 18S rifles, which are short-barreled carbines, which are extremely scarce today. That'll be a subject for a different video because I don't have access to one of those. But the most notable, probably the most notable non-American civilian market use of these was in Ireland, in Northern Ireland during the Troubles there. A substantial number of AR-18s or AR-180s got smuggled into Ireland, and they became iconic enough that they show up in Irish pop culture and literature about that period. When you hear about the IRA and the Armalite, it is the AR-180, not the AR-15. So that happened. And these rifles continue to sell today. They're popular collector's items today. They were actually reintroduced in 2000 as the AR-180B, which replaced the stamped sheet metal lower with a molded polymer lower and used AR-15 magazines, which was probably a good idea. But those didn't sell all that well. By 2007, they were out of production, and that, of course, was under the new Armalite. The company changed hands a couple times starting in the 1980s. In 1983, it went to Alisco Tool in the Philippines. In 95, it was sold to a guy named Mark Westrom, who owned Eagle Arms, and he incorporated Armalite, the Armalite brand name, which is basically all that it was at that point, into Eagle Arms. He sold, you'll find AR-10s that he manufactured and sold, as well as then later on AR-180Bs. Ultimately, the B, not very successful. People are much more interested in the original all-metal gun. So hopefully you guys enjoyed the video, learned something about Armalite. If you're interested in Rock Island, I will have links below to their Instagram and their YouTube channels. You should definitely check them out. They have some pretty cool stuff, both in their auctions and on their social media pages. Thanks for watching.